a young wolf abandoned by her mother, raised by a kind-hearted woman in Russia, and living alongside a young child. Do you wonder how this unlikely family came to be, and how a wild wolf could adapt to life with humans? Stay tuned for today's video on Animals Need Love and find out more. On a quiet day in Russia, Alida, a compassionate woman with a deep love for animals, found herself in a situation she never expected. She had always been drawn to animals in need, but nothing could prepare her for the moment when she met Kira, a young wolf cub abandoned at just 3 days old. Kira's story began in a shelter, where she and her siblings were left behind by their mother, a domesticated wolf who had been raised in a human home. Unfortunately, Kira's mother couldn't handle the responsibility of raising her pups and abandoned them. Left without the care they needed, the shelter staff was forced to step in and care for the tiny cubs, hand-feeding them and hoping they could survive. But the chances for Kira and her siblings to make it on their own in the wild were slim. Wolves rely on their mothers for survival skills like hunting and protection, and without these instincts, life in the wild would be nearly impossible. Alida had heard about Kira's situation and, after much thought, decided to step in. She knew that raising a wild animal wasn't like caring for a dog, but something about Kira's story called to her. The young wolf's chances of survival were virtually non-existent without human intervention, and Alida knew she could provide the loving home Kira needed. At just 28 days old, Alida took Kira home. The tiny wolf cub clung to her chest as they made their way into the apartment. Alida's heart raced with both excitement and anxiety. This was no ordinary pet. Raising a wolf wasn't like caring for a dog. It was an entirely different challenge, one that she hadn't fully prepared for. The moment they stepped inside, Kira froze. The apartment, quiet and unfamiliar, seemed overwhelming to the little cub. Her big amber eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the new surroundings. The low hum of the refrigerator, the rustling of papers on the table, and the distant sound of traffic outside, all of it was a foreign world to her. Alida gently set her down on the floor, crouching to her level. "It's okay, Kira. You're safe now," she whispered, her voice soft and reassuring. But Kira wasn't convinced. The cub whimpered, her small body trembling. She backed away toward the corner, trying to find refuge in the safety of the walls. Alida didn't rush. She knelt down and held out her hand slowly, allowing Kira the space to decide if she wanted to approach. "I know you're scared. I'm here," Alida said quietly. After a long moment, Kira took a tentative step forward, sniffing the air cautiously. Her tiny paws patted softly against the floor. She stopped when she got close enough to Alida, her nose twitching as she sniffed her hand. Alida smiled gently, watching the cub's curiosity begin to outweigh her fear. "Good girl," Alida praised quietly, holding her hand steady. Kira hesitated for another moment before gently nudging Alida's fingers with her wet nose. That was the beginning of their bond. For the next few days, Alida took things slow. Kira was still a tiny, fragile creature, and her fear of everything unfamiliar was evident in every little quiver of her body. Alida kept a close eye on her, making sure she felt safe and secure. At first, she would curl up in the corner of the room, her body curled tightly in on itself, unwilling to leave her little hiding spot. Alida knew she couldn't push Kira to adapt too quickly, so she simply stayed close. Every morning, she would prepare a small bowl of milk and sit with the cub as she ate. Kira would sip cautiously at first, as though unsure whether it was okay to trust Alida completely. But gradually, as the days went by, she began to relax. The sound of Alida's voice became a source of comfort. "Drink up, little one. You're growing strong," Alida would say softly, stroking Kira's small head as she drank. Kira's appetite gradually grew, and she began to explore the apartment more. At first, she would take small, hesitant steps. Alita could see her peeking around corners, sniffing the air and watching the world outside the window with wide, curious eyes. But every step forward was a victory, and Alita celebrated each one. She introduced Kira to more new things: a soft blanket to sleep on, the sound of the vacuum cleaner, the rattle of the kitchen utensils. All these sounds and sensations were terrifying to Kira at first, but Alita never forced anything. Instead, she used patience and repetition, letting Kira adjust at her own pace. "See? It's not so bad," Alita would say, her voice gentle as she carefully moved Kira toward new experiences. One evening, Alita tried to get Kira used to being outside, taking her for a short walk in the courtyard. It was a warm, quiet evening, and the world seemed peaceful enough for the little cub to take in her surroundings. But as soon as they stepped outside, Kira froze. The sounds of the world outside, the chirping of birds, the distant honk of a car made her ears flatten against her head in fear. "It's okay, Kira," Alita whispered, kneeling down and pulling her close. "You're okay. Let's take it slow." Alita held her close for a few moments, letting Kira's heartbeat settle. Slowly, she began walking around the courtyard, keeping a firm grip on the leash, but allowing the cub to lead the way. Kira hesitated at first, but soon the cub started sniffing the ground, her tail twitching. She was starting to feel the world outside wasn't as scary as she had thought. As they walked through the streets, the reactions from passers-by were a blend of curiosity, surprise, and fascination. Most couldn't help but stare at the sight of Alita walking her wolf. Kira, despite being domesticated, retained a striking wildness. Her thick fur, sharp eyes, and powerful yet graceful movements set her apart from the usual dogs people were accustomed to seeing. Through the months, Alita and Kira's bond grew stronger, and their story became a symbol of hope, kindness, and the chance to live with nature in a way that valued both the wild and the domestic. Alita's social media following continued to grow, with people from every corner of the world inspired by the story of the woman and the wolf. Their journey had not only touched the hearts of animal lovers, but had also sparked a movement of advocacy for the proper care and respect of wild animals, especially those displaced from their natural habitats. Kira, now a young adult wolf, had fully adapted to life with Alita, but she remained true to her wild instincts. She loved her trips to the forest, running freely through the trees, ears perked and nose twitching with excitement. Alita would often follow her, watching with admiration as Kira navigated the wild with a grace and confidence that spoke to her true nature. Yet, when the day was done, Kira would return home, curling up at Alita's feet or snuggling close to her on the couch, the warmth of their bond evident in every touch. One winter evening, as the snow gently fell outside, Alita sat by the window, watching Kira play in the snow-covered yard. She could see the wolf's joy as she bounded through the drifts, her fur glistening in the soft light of the setting sun. It was a quiet moment, yet it was a reminder of how far they had come. From the first day Kira had timidly stepped into Alita's home, to this beautiful and wild creature who now shared her life. Alita smiled softly, her heart full. Kira's presence had changed everything for her. Her understanding of animals, her approach to life, and her belief in the power of love and patience. She had witnessed Kira grow into her own, a unique and extraordinary wolf who had found her place in a world that was often difficult for wild creatures to navigate. "Look at you," Alita whispered, her voice filled with admiration. "You found your way, haven't you?" Kira looked up at her, her amber eyes sparkling with understanding. It was as though the wolf knew in her own way that this was where she belonged. with Alida. And then, with a leap, Kira bounded toward the window, pressing her face against the glass, as if inviting Alida to join her in the snow. Alida laughed, her heart swelling. She rose from her chair, stepping outside into the cold, and joined Kira in the snowy yard. The two of them stood there together, side by side, watching the night settle around them in peaceful silence. The world may have expected a wild wolf to stay in the forest, to remain untamed and untouched by human hands, but Kira had proven that with the right kind of care, trust, and love, even the wildest of creatures could find their place in a different kind of world, one where love transcended boundaries, where the line between the wild and the domestic blurred into something new and beautiful. And as Alida looked at Kira, her heart filled with gratitude for the incredible journey they had shared, she knew that their story was far from over. They had taught each other more than they ever could have imagined. For Alida, Kira was not just a wolf, not just a pet, but a companion, a friend, and a reminder that the world was full of possibilities, if only we are willing to open our hearts. Together they had proven that sometimes the most unlikely families were the ones who taught the world the greatest lessons of all. And as they stood in the snow, side by side, Alida knew that love, in all its forms, was the greatest force of all. That's the end of today's story. What do you think about Alida's decision to raise Kira? Have you ever had an experience with a wild animal, or perhaps helped an animal in need? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for sticking with us all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a big thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to turn on the bell and subscribe to our channel, Animals Need Love, so you never miss any of our new videos. Thank you for your support. Wishing you all peace, happiness, and a little bit of extra love today. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.